Good day, and welcome to our Critical Minerals for Our Energy Futures tour. Critical minerals are the hidden backbone of clean energy, currently irreplaceable in powering our global energy transformation, embedded and driving performance in EVs, wind turbines, solar panels, grids, and advanced clean technologies. The availability of 12 critical minerals and rare earth elements, specifically copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium, and lanthanum, bauxite, aluminum, and uranium underpins the reliability of our energy infrastructure. Now say all those 12 fast again. Yet today, extraction and processing are concentrated in a handful of regions, including Australasia, China, Kazakhstan, and Russia, Africa in the DRC, Namibia and Guinea, South America in Chile, Brazil, and Peru, and North America in Mexico, US, and Canada. The particular concentration of extraction and processing is currently creating strategic vulnerabilities in global supply chains, heightened in a world of growing trade and geopolitical tensions. This reality raises urgent questions. Where are these minerals sourced and who controls them? What environmental and social costs accompany extraction and processing? How resilient are current supply chains against geopolitical shocks? What policies and investments are shaping future access and security? What technologies could reduce dependency or enable recycling? These questions and answers define the direction of travel for energy security and climate goals. So today, we will survey the landscape and journey to the front lines, outlining major extraction and processing sites to see and understand the associated realities shaping our energy future. In doing so, we seek to build insight into the players, positions, and pressures driving global energy transformation to better engage and influence needed actions. Because without a clear view of the landscape, policy and investment decisions risk being blind to critical constraints and opportunities. The stakes are high. Energy security, economic competitiveness, and climate commitments all hinge on these materials. So join us in mapping the vulnerabilities and seeing the shape of strategies to secure our energy future. Let's remind ourselves where these 12 critical minerals sit in the periodic tables. You'll see that they cluster in 3 horizontal bands: the alkali-alkaline metals, the transition metals, and the lanthanides. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, and manganese are key transition alkali metals, cycling as ions in compound form, not as pure elementals, for battery materials. Copper and aluminum appear as pure metals, enabling connectivity through metallic bonding and electron mobility for electrical infrastructure and components. The rare earths, La, Pr, Nd, Tb, and Dy, occur together chemically, yet require industrial separation despite having similar properties. And a critical point is criticality isn't actually about rarity. It's about chemical behavior, separability, and processing complexity. That's what defines strategic value rather than just pure abundance. So now with that chemistry lesson in the rearview mirror, let's start our critical mineral and rare earth elements tour with copper, which wires our electrification boom. Embedded everywhere in electricity flows, in conducting power, connecting components, in removing heat in EVs, grids, charging station, renewables, buildings, and data centers, and usually as wiring, bus bars, transformers, connectors, and cooling elements. So given this role, we see copper featured in the headlines related to supply and demand and associated concerns regarding shortage and price levels and activities to stimulate supply and new sources amid current concentration. Specifically, structural deficits are talked up as electrification demand from EVs and grid updates, renewables, and data centers is anticipated to outrun new mine supply. In the short term, supply disruptions attributed to stoppages from geotechnical events and shutdowns at major copper operations are tightening inventories, fueling speculative stockpiling and price volatility. We see this in published 2025 rankings of the biggest copper mines as a reshuffle, with Chile output lagging and DRC growing, highlighting Chile's operational fragility in contrast with rising dominance from the Democratic Republic of Congo. On the copper price front, as the current London Metals Exchange price hit records, there are some divergent forecasts. Some expect pullbacks as supply responds, and others warn of persistent tightness given long project lead times. Amid price volatility and uncertainty, to unlock more tons, investment is pivoting to brownfield expansions and needing faster permitting to bring additional supply online. So Andy, let's see these headlines on the ground in copper players, positions, and places.
Mary, for each of our critical minerals, we're going to look at reserves, production, exports, imports, smelting and processing, and consumption. And so for copper, starting with the players and positions, we see that Chile and Peru, the DRC, Australia and Mexico dominate reserves, production and export of copper. We see quite clearly China's leverage. Despite being small in reserves and modest in mining, it dominates imports, smelting and consumption, and as such is a system choke point. And that Japan, South Korea, Germany and the USA are major importers with major smelting capacity and consumption. And as you highlighted in the headlines, this position overall creates a certain fragility. If the DRC exports or Chile production were to falter, the system would see a global shock. If Chinese smelting were to be disrupted, we would see an immediate downstream crisis. So let's go see 5 places in the world of copper. We first travel to Chile to see Escondida, then Cerro Verde in Peru, Buena Vista del Cobre in Mexico, Kamoa-Kakula in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Africa, and lastly, Huishi in China. Chile is the world's largest copper producer, supplying about 1/4 of the global mined copper output. Major mines include Escondida, Collahuasi, El Teniente, Chuquicamata, and Los Pelambres. And Chilean production today faces declining ore grades, water scarcity, aging infrastructure, and rising operating costs. And investment in Chilean copper focuses on brownfield expansions, desalination plants, and sustaining long-term export revenues. As we look down at Escondida below us, we see the world's largest copper mine operated by BHP in an international consortium with Rio Tinto and Japanese partners, supplies about 3.5% of current global copper demand. Ore is mined on site. Concentrators produce copper concentrate for export globally. It is located, as we can clearly see, in the Chilean Atacama Desert. It's one of the driest places on earth. Operations rely entirely on energy-intensive desalination and transportation via high-pressure pipelines to secure water for processing. And that makes the operations vulnerable to infrastructure and cost shocks. And sustaining 1 million tons per year of output in the open pit operation amid labor risks, ore grade decline, and these water constraints demands relentless efficiency, automation, and capital investment just to hold ground for export globally. Peru is the world's second largest copper producer, supplying 10 to 12% of global output from an ore grade, which is slightly higher than in Chile. The key mines in the country include Cerro Verde, Las Bambas, Antamina, Southern Copper Operations, and Quellaveco. And production growth has been constrained by ore grade declines, community protests, permitting delays, and transportation corridor disruptions. But Peru's long-term potential remains strong, with brownfield and large undeveloped Andean resources attracting continued investment. Below us we see Cerro Verde. It is one of the world's largest open-pit copper mines near Arequipa in southern Peru. I had the privilege of flying over it some years ago. Initially commissioned already in 1975 with successive concentrator upgrades to present capacity, and with a 2015-16 expansion amongst the biggest brownfield projects globally. It is operated by Freeport McMoran with partners of Buenaventura and Sumitomo of Japan, supplying roughly 2% of global copper demand. Ore is mined on site. 3 concentrators produce copper concentrate and cathodes for export to global markets. That massive concentrator expansion doubled its capacity, extending the mine's life significantly. However, also sustaining 400 to 450 kilotons per year amid low ore grades and ore grade decline, as well as water constraints, demands absolute continuous improvements via efficiency and with capital investments to maintain output. Mexico is a top 10 copper producer with 3% of global production share, controlled by a large integrated Grupo Mexico operations. And the key mines in the country include Buenavista del Cobre, La Caridad, and other Sonora district mines. And production from ore grades similar to Chile is at a much smaller scale and benefits from strong infrastructure in the country and smelting refining capacity that support exports and domestic use. But the Mexican risks include water scarcity, environmental incompliance, and labor relations affecting output stability. Below us we see the Buenavista del Cobre mine. It is a large open pit mine in Sonora, operated by Southern Copper, Grupo Mexico, and other major producers. It produces copper concentrate and cathodes, supplying both the domestic and export markets. It is an integrated mining, smelting, refining complex that supports a large-scale copper production. Expansion projects are increasing throughput, offset declining grades and cost pressures, and water management and environmental controls remain critical in the very arid Sonoran region. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is Africa's largest copper producer, contributing 9% of global supply and rapidly expanding its global market share. The country's flagship mines include Kamoa-Kakula, Tente Fungurume, Matunda, and Kamoto Copper. And the output is driven by high-grade deposits, Chinese investment in mining, and also Chinese investment in processing. The risks of the country include political uncertainty, infrastructure constraints, royalties, and ESG principle scrutiny over mining practices. Below us we see Kamoa-Kakula. It's operated by Ivanhoe Mines. It is among the world's largest high-grade copper deposits with exceptionally rich grades of 5% copper, nearly 9 times the current ore grade at Escondida. Currently produces 400,000 tons of copper annually. The logistics and infrastructure requirements necessitate a fully integrated facility that needs diesel and hydropower, electricity for mining, for crushing, for concentrating, and for smelting. And the ongoing expansion aims to double output and add smelting capacity with modular design to make it one of the most competitive new copper projects globally, based on the competitiveness of its very high ore grades. Let's travel next to see copper smelting in China. And as we saw earlier, China dominates global copper smelting and processing most of the imported concentrates worldwide. In fact, China imports 60% of global concentrate and smelting and processes 50% of global supply. And that smelting capacity in China has expanded rapidly, supported by infrastructure, scale, and state policy. Coastal and inland hubs cluster near ports, near power plants, near sulfuric acid markets. Environmental controls have been tightened, inefficient smelters have been closed, capacity has been consolidated nationally. But the smelting dominance gives China leverage over global copper concentrate markets. Below us we see Huishi copper smelter. It is the world's largest copper smelting complex, located in Jiangxi province. It is operated by Jiangxi Copper, integrating smelting and refining and production. It processes both domestic and imported concentrates at massive, continuous 24 hours a day scale. and its advanced flash smelting improves efficiency, recovery, and emissions performance. And Huishi, that we see here, anchors China's copper supply chain and downstream manufacturing. So, Mary, as we come to the end of our copper tour, copper presents three constraints and risks to the energy transition. Firstly, copper mining faces declining grades, water scarcity, and permitting delays that constrain supply growth. Copper smelting and refining is geographically concentrated in China, creating geopolitical and trade risks. And lastly, copper demand from grids, from electrical vehicles, and from renewables requires absolutely sustained expansion of primary supply.
Moving from copper that wires our power systems, let's explore lithium, which powers or enables electrochemical reactions that store and release energy for lithium-ion cells, cathodes, electrodes, and battery packs. Given this role, we see lithium featured in the headlines related to supply and demand, supply chain and supply vulnerabilities, price levels, and activities reshaping the market. On the market front, we see the current lithium price slump is reshaping industry, driving consolidation, partnerships, and delayed expansion, even as EV and energy storage long-term demand remains strong. The headlines also spotlight supply in terms of Greenbushes Australia, the world's largest hard rock lithium mine, supplying 20% of global output and viewed as a strategic asset for OEM, EV, and battery storage supply chains. Also on the supply side, Australia keeps the near-term markets well supplied, but conversion capacity remains China-centric, posing refining dependency risks. Meanwhile, for South American supply, water use and environmental scrutiny are intensifying for brine operations, prompting Chile and Andean nations to push state partnerships and resource nationalism. Also on the supply side, lithium recycling is still nascent, but could become a meaningful source of supply post-2030, influencing long-term market balance. And finally, technology and battery chemistry trends are now pivoting towards LFP batteries for cost and safety, while solid-state R&D accelerates, shaping future demand profiles and hydroxide versus carbonate requirements. So Andy, let's visit the players and places shaping the lithium industry market.
In lithium, we see that Chile, Australia, Argentina dominate mining and exports. That there's the Bolivian paradox. It has the largest reserves globally, but no material production or exports, and this illustrates how politics and water and technology can be constraints rather than geology. We see China's system power in lithium. It's not the biggest miner, but it dominates imports, processing, and consumption. It controls conversion of lithium to chemicals, and it owns the midstream leverage over the global EV supply chain. We also can quite clearly see the Western vulnerability. The US, Japan, Korea, and Germany have high consumption, low reserves, and their policy focus is on domestic refining, recycling, and allied offtakes. So overall, it is an extreme upstream and downstream separation in lithium. Let's pay 4 visits. First one is to Salar de Atacama in Chile, then Salar de Hombre Muerto in Argentina, Greenbushes in Australia, before we go to Ningde in China to a cattle battery factory. Chile is a top global lithium supplier with over 25% of market share, anchored by high-quality brine resources. And the country's policy on lithium is evolving in terms of state oversight, royalties, quotas, and permitting that shape the investment pace. And its strategic focus is on expanding output while tightening the governance of water and community legitimacy. Below us, we see the Salar de Atacama lithium mine. You can see brine, which is pumped, solar evaporated, and then chemically refined. And that water balance drives the ESG and politics around lithium production. It is a truly world-class lithium brine in the Salar in the northern Chilean Atacama Desert, exceptionally low-cost production, operated by SQM and Albemarle under state concessions, and it exports carbonate and hydroxide globally. Argentina is also a top global lithium producer with over 6% market share, anchored in the Andean lithium triangle. And the federal system in Argentina grants provinces control over lithium production, and their policies favor investment and rapid project development. Production is diversified across multiple salars, reducing the single asset risk that one sees in Chile. And Argentinian growth is driven by brines and the emerging direct lithium extraction methods to reduce water and land use amidst currency challenges, infrastructure, and also ESG challenges in the country. The Salar de Hombre Muerto that we see below us is Argentina's most established lithium brine district. It's the long-running operations prove chemistry, has proven infrastructure, and it's very low-cost production. And it produces lithium carbonate, which via hydroxide in the downstream is converted to battery markets. But water balance, community relations, and expansion sequencing shape Argentina's long-term growth. Australia is the world's largest lithium producer, with a share of 50% of global mined lithium dominated by hard rock spodumene mines. Its supply strength lies in its reliable mining, its export logistics, and growing domestic refining capacity. And that output is concentrated in Western Australia, where projects scale quickly with conventional open pit methods. But the key Australian risks are price cycles, permitting, and downstream competitive versus China's low-cost refineries. Below us, we see Greenbushes, which is the world's largest hard rock lithium mine, producing high-grade spodumene for global battery supply chains. That concentrate feeds China and the emerging Australian refineries, while ongoing expansion upgrades of the pits and processing facilities are taking place. But if you look at the mine, look at it at scale below us, you can see the lithium environmental footprint. The growth is constrained by community, water, and tailings management. Batteries have become the major use of lithium, and China leads battery manufacturing by scale, by supply density, and some very fast learning cycles across materials, cells, packs, and equipment. But Chinese business environment is also becoming more complicated, and the bottleneck is increasingly having to deal with quality and cost and compliance and safety and traceability and carbon footprint, not just capacity. But China's supply chain advantage comes from clustered ecosystems, cathodes, anodes, electrolytes, separators, and the formation and testing facilities. CATL is the world's largest cell maker, supplying many automakers with both high volume products and premium performance chemistries. And CATL's edge is industrial execution, high yields, fast scale up, deep integration with key materials and manufacturing equipment. And its strategy focus is to diversify its factories globally, reducing battery cost, improving safety, and locking long-term customer contracts. And below us we see the CATL plant in Ningde in China. It is their anchor campus. It's their headquarters plus that large-scale cell manufacturing facility, but also the associated testing, logistics, and supplier support. And the site is built as a production cluster, and we can see the multiple long factory halls. It has port access, road access, strong electrical grid connections, lots of industrial land, mature local workforce, good supply base. And inside the factory we can see the automated robotic arms stacking battery cells, transferring components, and conveying the lithium-ion cells through precision assembly lines. So as we end our lithium tour, Mary Lithium presents three constraints and risks to the energy transition. Firstly, lithium processing capacity lags well behind demand growth. This creates bottlenecks despite ample global lithium reserves. Secondly, lithium supply chains remain concentrated geographically, especially through China, increasing exposure to geopolitical and policy risks. And thirdly, the lithium markets are highly volatile, with rapid capacity shifts amplifying price cycles and investment uncertainty.
Now we look at nickel. Critical to enable high energy cathodes that boost batteries' ability to store more power in the same space, which means longer driving range for EVs and better performance for devices. The headlights provide us with a nickel snapshot, highlighting supply dynamics and processing concerns. More specifically, Indonesia has cemented its ecosystem dominance in laterite, its nickel-rich ore, and a low-cost niche product for making stainless steel, or through high-pressure acid leaching to make high-purity nickel for batteries. This footprint of laterite processing is in turn raising ESG concerns in processing emissions and tailing risk. The headlines also speak to the economics of battery-grade nickel under pressure, as supply outpaces EV cathode demand for nickel-based batteries amid emerging battery chemistry preference changes, pressuring margins, amid slowing penetration of nickel batteries. On the supply side, there's further pressure as the Philippines remains a key swing supplier. Overall, in this landscape, with prices subdued, miners are pivoting to cost control and downstream integration and refining partnerships rather than new greenfield mines. So Andy, let's visit the nickel landscape.
Mary, as you noted in the headlines, in terms of players and position, India is structurally dominant in global nickel. It has the largest reserves, largest production and processing growth. It has seen a policy-driven shift from being an exporter to domestic and refining powerhouse. But there are also significant reserves and production exports from the Philippines, Russia, Australia and Brazil. Yes, like in so many other critical minerals, China has midstream control. Despite modest reserves in mining, it dominates once again smelting, refining and consumption, and it sets price and specification benchmarks. And we can also quite clearly see the imports and processing in Japan, South Korea and the United States. But let's remind ourselves that nickel has a bifurcated market. Stainless steel anchors demand and battery demand is volatile as nickel and lithium battle it out for battery technology in the world. Let's visit 5 places. We go to Weda Bay in Indonesia, Morowali in Indonesia, Taganito in the Philippines, Norilsk in Russia, and Yinshuan in China. Indonesia is the world's largest nickel producer with a share of more than 45% of the global mined nickel for stainless steel and increasingly then also for batteries. Its supply chain strength lies in massive laterite reserves, aggressive investment in high-pressure acid leaching for battery-grade nickel, but the key risks remain the surplus and changing battery chemistry. And within the country, the key players are Tsingshan, Vale Indonesia, and Antam. Below us we see the Weda mine. It's a large laterite nickel mine on Halmahera Island in the eastern provinces of Indonesia. It's owned by Tsingshan and Eramet, operated by Weda Bay. It's an open pit laterite mine which feeds nickel processing and battery supply chains, and is integrated with an industrial park which includes smelters, power, infrastructure and logistics, as we will see in a moment. Indonesia's export bans accelerated domestic processing and also rapid capacity expansion. At the same time, environmental scrutiny is increasingly high due to rainforest impacts and tailing management. Not only does Indonesia lead in nickel output, but it's also leading player with 20% of the processing share with high pressure acid leach plants making mixed hydroxide precipitate for EV cathode supply. As well, nickel pig iron and ferronickel smelters support stainless steel exports from Sulawesi parks, and the country has processing hubs in Morowali, in Weda Bay, in Obi Island, in Pomala, and they are all expanding quite rapidly. Major risk in the country is the fact that coal power raises emission concerns, and the policy push has been very much towards domestic refining. Raw ore export bans have reshaped the trade flows. Below us we see Morowali. It is the world's largest nickel processing hub. It integrates smelting and power generation, and it's a deep water port. It processes only Indonesian laterite ore into nickel pig iron, into matte and battery intermediates. It hosts many operators, they're mainly Chinese-Indonesian joint ventures, within that one industrial park. The coal-fired power generation is captive, but it also underpins the ESG scrutiny because it raises emissions. It is central to global stainless steel and EV battery supply chains. And overall, Morowali integrates ore handling, power, smelting, and ports into a single nickel export engine. The Philippines has a share of 10% of global nickel, mostly laterite ores for stainless steel feedstock, and the country's strength lies in its ore exports to China because it has very limited refining capacity. Below us we see Taganito. It's a major nickel mine. It's operated by Taganito Mining, a Nickel Asia subsidiary. Laterite ore is shipped to Taganito, where high pressure acid leaching plant takes place in nearby Claver, and that high pressure acid leaching produces mixed hydroxide precipitate for export for batteries. And the Philippines is rapidly trying to expand its refining through nickel sulfates, but ESG considerations and power constraints persist, limiting its growth. Next we travel to Russia. Russia is a major nickel producer, 10% of global supply. That is anchored in Norilsk Nickel, which supplies class 1 nickel for both batteries and stainless steel. The reality is that sanctions, Arctic logistics, and environmental legacies starting in the Soviet era creates supply challenges, ESG challenges, and also the geopolitical risks for global nickel markets. Below us we see Norilsk Nickel. The Norilsk Talnak complex mines nickel copper, but also platinum group metals in Arctic Siberia, Russia, all year round. It is owned by Nornickel. It controls one of the world's richest sulfide deposits. It's an underground mine which uses mechanized stoping. The extreme cold demands logistics discipline. And the processing which takes place at Talnak and Nadezhda concentrators, smelting, refining, matte locally. The nickel and copper is shipped via the Dudinka port and along the Yenisei route northbound. And so it exports, feeds stainless steel batteries and catalysts, but sanctions are reshaping those flows. Our final nickel stop is in China, because China, as we saw earlier, dominates global nickel processing with over 65% share, despite limited domestic nickel ore resources. China's nickel processing leadership is built on imported concentrates, matte and laterite feedstocks, and China controls most of the global nickel sulfate production for battery cathodes. Environmental considerations, energy limitations, and policy constraints are increasingly shaping the processing expansion choices that China is making. Below us, we see the Yinchuan nickel smelting and refining complex. It is China's largest integrated nickel copper smelting and refining hub. It processes sulfide ores into matte, into refined nickel, into copper, cobalt and other byproducts. It is a fully integrated system which includes smelting, power, slag handling and tailings management. And this strategic asset underpins China's stainless steel and battery manufacturing supply chains. So as we conclude our nickel tour, let me share 3 takeaways on nickel's constraints and risks to the energy transition. Firstly, nickel supply is constrained by costly, complex and environmentally sensitive processing routes. Secondly, nickel refinery is geopolitically concentrated, particularly in only Indonesia and China. And thirdly, nickel processing relies very heavily on coal-fired power in both those countries. Tailings and high-pressure acid leaching waste threaten environmental acceptance and also, as a result of that, financing.
Now, turning to cobalt, a companion of nickel that stabilizes high nickel batteries, we look to recent headlines to characterize the landscape, defined by supply risks, concentration, and ethics, while demand trends show gradual intensity reduction, but not elimination, keeping cobalt strategically relevant for high-performance batteries. Specifically, on the supply risk, we see the DRC featured as it introduces cobalt export quotas after a suspension, introducing a policy-driven supply risk with export shipment contingent on government approvals and compliance checks. Consequently, the cobalt prices have rebounded sharply on tightened supply policy, triggering a price recovery after a prior weakness, but underscoring market fragility associated with policy risk under geopolitical supply concentration. As geopolitics and control is further reinforced in the headlines on quota allocations directing the largest shares to China Molybdenum Company and Glencore, reinforcing their dominance in global cobalt trade. Underlying the China molybdenum allocation is its ownership of cobalt mines in the DRC and its position as the world's largest producer of other critical minerals. Amid this dominance, OEMs are demanding traceability and royalty prepayment as new gatekeepers for the exports, with ethical sourcing and financial compliance now prerequisites for moving cobalt out of the DRC. All the headlines underscore that supply remains policy fragile, even as battery chemistries continue to reduce cobalt intensity as EV makers cut cobalt per battery. Geopolitical and regulatory risk keep supply security top concern. So Andy, let's see this cobalt landscape on the ground.
In cobalt, we see the strength of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, followed by Australia and Indonesia in the upstream, both in terms of reserves but also production and exports. We likewise see China's domination in the downstream. 70% of import refining consumption sits in China. And then we see that Finland, Belgium, Japan and Korea punch above their weight in refining. Let's visit 4 places: Matunda and Metal Coal in the DRC, and then we go to Murun Murun in Australia before we go to Huaihou in China. The Democratic Republic of the Congo dominates cobalt supply with a 70% market share from big mines like Mutanda, Tenke Fungurume, Kisanfu and Kamoto. And then there is also Metal Coal, which we'll look at in a moment. The cobalt produced is mainly as a copper byproduct from large-scale copper belt mines. And as Mary noted, CMOC and Glencore operate most of the DRC output. China refines the majority of its volumes. Very high-grade ores drive growth. Policy, royalties, export rules create considerable volatility. And in the DRC, ESG risks persist. They relate to artisanal mining, traceability of cobalt, community involvement in environmental scrutiny. Mutanda mine, which we see below us, is the world's largest cobalt producing mine. It is located in Lualaba. It's operated by Glencore. produces cobalt as a byproduct of copper mining like so many other mines. Its production is highly sensitive to prices, to royalties, and the DRC's emerging regulatory decisions. But it is central to battery supply chain, and ESG scrutiny is rising, and the artisanal mining risks and concerns about that persist. Also in the DRC is the Metal tailings reclamation project in Kolwezi. It is owned by the Eurasian Resources Group, and it's operated as a hydrometallurgical processing facility which reprocesses historic tailings. So it's not a conventional mine, and it considerably reduces legacy environmental liabilities. Importantly, it produces cobalt hydroxide and copper cathodes for the export market, and the feedstock is sourced from multiple legacy sites across the whole Katanga copper belt. It is strategic due to its low mining risks, its ESG benefits, and helping the DRC to establish its cobalt dominance. Australia contributes about 4% to global cobalt supply. It is a secondary cobalt producer supplying cobalt as a byproduct from nickel and copper mines. The country's output is modest but politically low risk, appealing to battery makers seeking diversification from the DRC. And Australian growth depends on nickel project economics, processing capability, and ESG-driven supply chain demands. Below us we see Murrin. It's a major nickel cobalt laterite operation in Western Australia, operated by Minara Mines, wholly owned by Glencore, and it uses the same high pressure acid leaching process to produce nickel and cobalt on site, and that nickel and cobalt output feeds batteries and stainless steel supply chain. So overall, Murrin is a fully integrated high pressure acid leaching refining combined with acid power, pressure, and hydrometallurgy facilities at scale. We close our cobalt visit by traveling to China. And China refines most of the world's cobalt into battery chemicals, turning all the imported intermediates that we saw in other countries into cobalt sulfate and cathode materials. The choke point is chemical processing capacity and know-how, not the ore, and dissolving, purifying, crystallizing, and qualifying battery-grade cobalt is complex. The risks sit in concentration and regulation, environmental compliance, energy water intensity, and export controls can tighten global cobalt supply from China quite quickly. Below us we see the Huaihou Cobalt Facility. It is a leading cobalt refinery, battery materials producer that converts cobalt feedstocks into battery-grade cobalt chemicals and precursors. And its advantage is integration. What we see below us is upstream sourcing plus very large volume refining and materials plant that can supply cell makers consistently at industrial volumes. But its footprint also makes it strategically important. It is exposed in a city to ESG scrutiny. It is exposed to supply chain transparency demands, and policy shifts within China also impacts cobalt. So we close our cobalt trip with 3 constraints and risks to the energy transition. Firstly, that cobalt supply is highly concentrated, as we saw in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, creating geopolitical and ethical risk. Secondly, that cobalt processing is dominated by China, as we also saw, increasing downstream dependency and supply chain vulnerability. And lastly, that cobalt demand faces long-term uncertainty because of changing battery chemistries as manufacturers seek to reduce or eliminate cobalt use.
Now let's explore graphite. In a brief chemistry lesson, graphite is carbon formed when organic material is transformed by heat and pressure deep underground. Graphite is the backbone of the battery anode because it holds and releases lithium ions during the charging and discharging, making it essential for storing energy in most lithium-ion batteries. In the headlines, we see graphite shaped by processing bottlenecks and China's dominance in anode production, even as mining restarts and new projects emerge. More specifically, the headlines speak to Mozambique's Balama mine posting first quarter output since its mid-2025 restart, reinforcing supply for natural granite amid prior disruptions. Also in the headlines are policy-driven diversification efforts on the material diversification, downstream supply chain, emphasizing processing, not mining, and focused on non-China anode material diversification and investment in alternative upstream sources. Among the upstream, Madagascar projects remain important but face financing and operational volatility due to the political risk and funding challenges, despite Madagascar being a key natural graphite supplier. Also noted are new entrants in Brazil and Tanzania seeking to add niche large flake capacity, but scale remains limited compared to dominant players. So Andy, let's explore the graphite players and the landscape on the ground.
In global graphite, we see quite clearly that China dominates mining, and the real choke point, the purification, the spheronization, and the coating as it relates to anodes. That Mozambique, Madagascar, and Brazil are major upstream exporters of natural graphite flakes, and that Japan, Korea, Germany, and the US are downstream importers with growing non-China processing ambitions. To see all that in real life, let's visit Heilongjiang province in China, Balama in Mozambique, and Molo in Madagascar. China dominates graphite mining, graphite processing, and also graphite downstream anode materials for batteries globally. And the processing, the purification, the shaping capacity matter more than the graphite ore availability for graphite. Environmental regulation in China is tightening, and that is leading to the consolidation of production to fewer larger industrial clusters. But graphite remains strategically critical for batteries, for refractories, and advanced industrial materials. Here at the Heilongjiang Graphite Cluster, we see a dense cluster that integrates open pit mines, concentrators, tailings, and downstream processing facilities. The short haul distances reduce costs between mining, flotation, and the purification stages. There are multiple operators that share infrastructure, power, water management, and skilled labor pools in the area. And it illustrates China's advantage: industrial scale graphite ecosystems, not isolated mines. From China, we move south to Mozambique, that contributes about 10% of global graphite supply, but is a growing source of graphite in terms of diversification. And below us, we see Balama. The Australia-based Syrah company operates one of the world's largest graphite mines. It is flake, mined in open pit ore, crushed, floated into natural graphite concentrate on site, and it's then dried, bagged, and trucked to port for export, mainly to Asia and mainly to China. It produces multiple flake sizes for battery anodes and industrial markets. And the ramp up of Balama is quite sensitive to graphite prices, to power supply in Mozambique, security situation in Mozambique, and also logistical risks. Tanzania hosts some of Africa's highest grade natural graphite, attracting international developers and battery interest. But project progress in general depends on permitting stability in that country, infrastructure development, and securing downstream processing partnerships. The Lindi Jumbo Graphite Project below us is one of the world's highest grade graphite deposits, enabling very low cost open pit mining. It has a very simple processing flow sheet, crushing, flotation, which renders high purity concentrate, and the coastal location near Mtwara reduces transportation distances to the port and also to export markets. And expansion project timelines are influenced by financing conditions and global graphite market cycles. We end our graphite tour in Madagascar that contributes about 7% of flake graphite supply, but with severe infrastructure challenges and aspirations to diversify in processing. But Madagascar's strength remains its flake graphite exports. Below us we see the Molo graphite mine in southern Madagascar, operated by Nextsource Materials. It has some very high purity flake graphite for batteries and anodes that are sought after globally. It's an open pit operation, as we can see, simple crushing, then flotation to graphite concentrate on site. And that concentrate is trucked to port, exported to Asia, to Europe, and to North America. The Madagascar has downstream plans, value-added spherical graphite processing in future for EVs and EV supply chains, and it remains strategic as a non-China source. Financing and ramping up remains the key risks always in Madagascar. So, Mary, as we close our graphite tour, graphite presents three constraints and risks to the energy transition. The first one is that graphite processing is also highly concentrated, creating geopolitical risk beyond China and supply chain vulnerability despite widespread graphite ore availability. Graphite purification is energy and chemical intensive, raising environmental permitting and cost risk for the scalability of supply. And when it comes to demand, graphite demand is tightly linked to battery growth, exposing supply to volatility as technologies, recycling, and battery chemistries evolve.
Turning to rare earths, and again, not necessarily rare in abundance, but in access and processing complexity. We look at neodymium and praseodymium, essential for high-strength permanent magnets that power EV motors and wind turbines. Dysprosium and terbium, indispensable for heat-resistant magnets that keep EV motors and wind turbines performing under high temps, and critical for electrification at scale. And lanthanum, a light rare earth element with a critical role in catalysts and certain battery chemistries. And here we see its abundance, while relatively stable supply compared to some of the other heavy rare earth elements, has strategic considerations around refining capacity and geopolitical control. So, in the news are recent developments in this race to secure supply chains as enablers of electrification, and a race increasingly shaped by geopolitical alliances, national security imperatives, and new corporate partnerships and investment, all amid this current fragility and exposure to China control. More specifically, the headlines highlight Goldman Sachs' warning of escalating disruption risk, underscoring market volatility in both price and supply, and the urgency for alternative supply routes. And echoed in shockwaves from China's imposed export controls earlier in 2025 on 7 heavy rare earths and magnets, which triggered immediate supply shocks, and under sharp export drops and factory disruptions across the EV supply chains themselves. We also see diversification efforts and global partnerships in the US with MP Materials and their JV with Saudi Martin, reinforcing the global dimensions of rare earth mining investments in a US domestic revival in MP Materials launching the NdPr metal magnet production, and again signaling the push for supply independence, as well as in Australia-led Malaysia, but located breakthrough in commercially viable production outside China in Malaysia. So Andy, let's visit the rare earth landscape, starting with a side trip to the most talked about headline space in critical minerals and rare earths, Greenland. Greenland is in the crosshairs of the diversification thrust and being coveted as a host of rare earths and in the crosshairs of regional concern about environmental degradation. The focus of current attention is on rare earths, and deposits also include graphite, copper, zinc, iron ore, alongside with the rare earth minerals. Most of the rare earths resource potential are light rare earths, and heavy rare earths, dysprosium and terbium, remain marginal. There's uranium associated with the rare earth deposit. It complicates the mining approvals and political acceptance, as Greenland has banned uranium. And as we can't ignore in the news, EU and US see Greenland as a diversification play from China-dominated supply, with the US aggressively pursuing this.
Looking beyond Greenland, let's first look at the global rare earths picture. It is clear that China dominates the system end to end, especially in separation, processing and downstream pool. That Australia, Russia, Vietnam, the US, Myanmar, Nigeria and Thailand matter in terms of mining volumes, but generally sit inside China-linked processing pathways. And that Japan, Malaysia and Estonia show up very strongly in terms of imports and processing nodes. Japan on the one hand as manufacturing pool and Malaysia as a processing hub. And to understand rare earths, we must visit 4 places. Bayan Obo in China, Mount Weld in Australia, Mountain Pass in California in the United States, and Chipipanga in Myanmar. China dominates rare earth separation and refining capacity, not just mining, shaping global supply reliability. And the Chinese policy tools of quotas and export controls and environmental rules are used to steer prices, market consolidation, and also downstream investment. China leads in downstream conversion, the rare earths oxides to metals, to alloys, to permanent magnets for motors and turbines. And Chinese supply is split between light rare earths, high volume, and heavy rare earths, much scarcer, much higher strategic value. But it is also real that environmental management and higher regulation have reduced the wildcat production of the past, but legacy tailings and waste remains sensitive. Let's visit the most talked about place in the world in terms of rare earth production, which is Bayan Obo, which is in Inner Mongolia and that we see below us. It is the world's largest rare earth mining complex, integrated with a major iron production. It is operated by Baogang, and it feeds the Baotao rare earth processing and magnet manufacturing ecosystem. Output is light rare earths dominated, lanthanum and cerium by volume, but also neodymium and praseodymium for magnets. And the co-products of iron and niobium materially shape the economics, really important, buffering rare earth price cycles for China. The major environmental legacy, which is quite ugly in the area, is linked to tailings and processing residues. It sits in huge tailing dams. Remediation and oversight of that remains central issues for China. Travelling south, we arrive in Australia because Australia is the key non-Chinese supplier of rare earth ores and concentrates, anchored in Lynas' Mount Weld complex. Australia's strategic value is as diversified feedstock for global magnet supply chains and an alternative to China. But the main Australian bottleneck is downstream processing. Australia exports concentrate for separation and refining offshore, often in China. Growth depends on permitting, financing and building separation refining capacity with strong environmental controls required in Australia. But policy support is rising because rare earths are critical for motors and turbines and defence electronics as seen by Australia. Below us we see Mount Weld in Western Australia. It is a high-grade rare earth mine operated by Lynas. It produces concentrate from an open-pit laterite mine. The ore mix is light earth dominated with strong neodymium and praseodymium content. The concentrate is trucked to Kalgoorlie, then transported to port and shipped to Malaysia for separating and refining outside of China. So Mount Weld is a major non-China feed source supporting permanent magnets in electric vehicles, wind turbines and defense systems, and its expansion is focusing on sustaining a long-term mine life and lifting neodymium praseodymium output, reducing the West's exposure to a single country supply risk. From Australia we travel to the United States, where the country is rebuilding a domestic rare earth supply chain with Mountain Pass as the anchor asset in that process. The national priority in the US is magnets, turning rare earth oxides into metal, alloy and finished magnet capacity onshore within the United States. But the United States remains light earth dominated. The heavy rare earths are continuing to be a strategic gap. And the government's supports and defence procurement are the major demand signals shaping investment timelines for the private sector. But the key risk in the US remains midstream capability and permitting space, not geology. Mountain Pass in California is the United States' only scaled rare earth mine and processing site operated by MP Materials. And what we see below us is an open pit carbonatite deposit producing a light earth basket including neodymium and praseodymium and cerium and lanthanum. And the site, as we can see, is integrated through mining, milling and flotation with on-site separation and refining capacity expanded over time. In the past, concentrate moved to China for downstream processing, and that strategy is now reversed to keep more value add within the United States. At the same time, expansion is explicitly tied to the United States magnet supply chain and geopolitics, with public funding and defense demand supporting Mountain Pass growth. A new supplier in rare earths is Myanmar, which currently contributes about 8% of heavy rare earths, but much of that material is still being processed in China. And we look down at Chipi Pangwa in Myanmar, where mining of rare earths has boomed, but very close to the Chinese border. And the site is controlled by armed groups exporting concentrates to China. And it involves dysprosium, terbium, and but the conflict is constantly disrupting any stable supply chain. Mining has expanded quite rapidly since the 2021 coup d'etat, but it has seen severe environmental damage with limited environmental regulation. Trade was paused after the 2024 Kachin Independent Army-controlled pressurized China, but renegotiations reopened the border trade and now continues. Myanmar's rare earth supply is critical to global supplies, but highlights the security risks and geopolitical leverage that comes from new mineral supply. So Mary, as we conclude our rare earths tour, there are three risks and constraints of rare earths to the energy transition. The first one is that, as we've seen clearly, rare earth processing and separation remains highly concentrated in China, creating geopolitical and trade risks for clean energy supply chains. The second one is that magnet-grade rare earths face bottlenecks in refining in China and metal making in China, but not in mining. That slows the deployment of wind and electric vehicles. And the third one is that heavy rare earth scarcity, not light earth scarcity, limits high-performance magnets, constraining efficiency gains in motors and generators.
Let's round out our tour by turning back to critical minerals, and specifically aluminum, which serves to reduce weight of vehicles and infrastructure, minimizing the power required to movement and logistics, thereby lightweighting it. In the headlines, we see ongoing and increasing systematic risk for global supply chains in geopolitics, trade tensions, and associated impacts in prices and flows, pretty similar for other critical minerals. Specifically, Guinea bauxite exports have hit records on China's demand and tightened China's grip on supply, as well as license revocations and more broadly regulatory change and resource nationalism impacting flows and price volatility, especially as alternative sources in India and in Indonesia struggle to make scale. We also see trade tensions impacting as aluminum prices surge as the US reinstates tariffs on Canadian imports amid trade tensions, with North American supply chains facing cost pressures due to these tariffs and forcing US buyers to seek alternative sources or pay premiums for domestic production. As well, pending regulatory changes are also flagged in the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will reshape aluminum trade flows. And automakers are accelerating aluminum recycling to cut costs and emissions as supply security lever, albeit with a minor share of supply. So Andy, let's visit the aluminum landscape and the players and places highlighted in the news.
Mary, in bauxite, it is clear that Guinea and Australia are the upstream bauxite production powerhouses, that China is the full stack giant with importing capacity, smelting capacity and consumption, that the US and Japan are heavy consumers with a limited upstream production, and that Canada and Russia are the major smelters relative to their domestic consumption. To understand global bauxite and aluminium better, let's go to Bouquet in Guinea in West Africa, to Waipa in Australia, to Baotao in China, and to Alouette in Canada. Guinea in Africa holds the world's largest bauxite reserves, underpinning long-term global aluminium supply. Production in Guinea has grown rapidly, driven by Chinese, Russian, and Middle Eastern investors. The bauxite is mined inland and exported via rail to the coastal ports like Kamsa and Dapilon. And Guinea exports raw bauxite mainly to China, with very limited domestic alumina refining. The political stability of Guinea, infrastructure capacity, and ESG expectations will shape the future of bauxite expansion in the country. Below us we see Kamsa. The Bouquet region behind it drives Guinea's bauxite boom. It's among the world's biggest export hubs, and the two major operators are SMB Winning and CBG, and they process the high-grade plateaus around Sangaredi. Below us we see the exports via ship from Kamsar. Next to it is Dapilon on the Rio Nunes. And Guinea's policy shift, which increasingly pushes for local refining and the associated license revocations, triggered major arbitration claims. Australia is a major seaborne bauxite exporter, shaping global alumina and aluminium supply chains. Australian production is concentrated in Queensland and Western Australia, supported in both areas by stable policy and infrastructure. Australian bauxite also feeds the domestic alumina refineries and export markets in Asia, and its competitiveness comes from scale, from Australian reliable logistics and integrated mine and refinery systems. But the main constraints are land access, environmental approvals, water stewardship in a dry country, and energy costs downstream. Below us we see Waipa at Cape York in Queensland. It's one of the world's largest bauxite mining complexes, operated by Rio Tinto. We can see the multiple shallow pits, which are mined sequentially with a well-developed rehabilitation program. That bauxite supplies Queensland Alumina Refinery but also supports export demand from China and Japan. Shipping uses the port of Waipa with barges and bulk carriers. Seasonal constraints are managed, and the key issues for Waipa are the indigenous land agreements, the biodiversity protection in the area, dust control, and water and tailings oversight. And then we come to China. China produces 60% of global primary aluminium, driven by its immense smelting capacity. That smelting is clustered in Inner Mongolia, in Xinjiang, in Shandong and Yunnan provinces, close to power supply and close to industry. Power has been quite coal-dominated, as we know, with a gradual shift towards lower carbon electricity in some of the provinces. And China offers a full integrated value chain of bauxite to alumina, alumina to aluminium, aluminium to semi-fabricated product chains. And China mainly exports aluminium products, shaping global prices and trade flows more than raw material exports. Below us, we see Baotao in Inner Mongolia. It is a major multi-potline aluminium smelting complex. It's not a single smelter site. The very visible long halls are the potlines producing primary aluminium metal at scale. And as we can see, the site includes extensive gas treatment and utilities, typical of an international modern smelter footprint. But the location reflects China's model: cheap, reliable power and industrial clustering in Inner Mongolia. And Baotao illustrates the core constraints for aluminium. Power sources and carbon intensity will drive competitiveness and international scrutiny. Canada's aluminium industry is among the world's lowest carbon, powered largely by hydroelectricity. The smelters are concentrated in Quebec, most of the sites, and British Columbia, one major site. And the industry is export-oriented, supplying North American and global markets with clean, low-carbon metal. The major owners are Rio Tinto and Alcoa. And the key constraints in Canada are power availability, grid contracts, labor, and competitiveness versus the subsidized coal-based metal from China. Below us, we see Alouette in Quebec. It is a flagship smelter with multiple long potlines that we can clearly see. Its competitiveness hinges on hydroelectric power, giving low greenhouse gas intensity per ton. And Alouette exemplifies Canada's strategic role. It is scalable, it is low carbon, and it exports for vehicles, for packaging, and for grids. So in closing, Mary, bauxite and aluminium presents 5 constraints and risks to the global energy transition. The first one is that aluminium smelting is extremely power intensive, and carbon intensity depends on its power source. The second one is the familiar geographic mismatch, because bauxite mining, alumina refining and smelting often occur in different regions, which increases the geopolitical and logistical risk. The third one is environmental pressure, because tailings from red mud, water use and land impacts raise permitting and social license challenges. The fourth one is energy price exposure, because aluminium competitiveness is highly sensitive to electricity costs and grid stability. And the last one is trade policy risk, stemming from export controls, carbon border measures such as the European ones, and industrial subsidies, which all distort global aluminium flows.
Our final visit of our tour is to uranium, the essential fuel for nuclear power, delivering low-carbon baseload where demand is rising sharply, and control of uranium is increasingly seen as a strategic resource for energy security, climate goals, and the next wave of industrial growth. Accordingly, the headlines speak to aspirations and fledgling actions for uranium and its fuel supply chain on diversification and broader capacity, amid supply chain fragility, especially around conversion and enrichment choke points, slow timeframes for mine development and processing innovation, and overall geopolitical risk and policy dependence with attendant price volatility and uncertain economics. In the first headline, we see uranium's narrative shift to AI centers and grid reliability that is stoking new demand and uranium supply interests for the next decade. Yet, the major suppliers, despite being the world's largest producers, are weighing slower expansion as much uncertainty remains in the shape of future demand. In terms of new frontier investment, we again see Greenland in the headlines where uranium is banned, yet strategically linked to rare earth politics and adding friction to G7-led diversification strategies. Also featured in the headlines associated with national security priorities and diversification strategies is U.S. fuel cycle push in milestones tackling broader LEU conversion enrichment capacity that remains a bottleneck, and where reliance on Russian enrichment continues into the late decade until major investment accelerates. As well, on the other side of the world, we see Kazakhstan moving into fuel production, and another example of midstream progress with uranium being real yet fledgling in the supply chain. So, Andy, let's visit the uranium landscape in terms of key players and the facilities behind these headlines.
Looking at global uranium, we can clearly see that the upstream exporters are Australia, Kazakhstan, Canada, Russia, Namibia, Niger, and Uzbekistan. That Russia is an absolute fuel cycle choke point because Russia remains outsized in conversion and enrichment, and that the big consumers and importers, China and the US, France and Japan, all have developed a strong fuel cycle capability. To understand global uranium better, let's visit Inkai in Kazakhstan, the Ural Electrical Combine in Russia, MacArthur River in Canada, Olympic Dam in Australia, and Husab in Namibia. The first stop on a uranium tour has to be Kazakhstan because it's the world's largest uranium producer, supplying 40% of mine output. And that production style is dominated by in-situ recovery, delivering the lowest cost uranium globally. The state producer Kazatomprom coordinates output, pacing expansion to manage prices, and uranium is exported for conversion, for enrichment, and for fuel fabrication abroad. But the key Kazakhstan risks include geopolitics, logistic corridors to get it to international markets, and fuel cycle bottlenecks beyond mining. Below us we see Inkai. It is in southern Kazakhstan, operated by Inkai Company, and it's a joint venture between Kazatomprom and Cameco. It uses in-situ recovery, which dissolves the uranium underground and processing on-site into yellow cake, and we can see the layout of the mine. And despite the very low ore grades, the scale and the in-situ recovery method makes it highly cost competitive. Output is exported for conversion and enrichment, and it fuels reactors worldwide. Expansion is being slowly paced. Our second stop on our uranium tour has to be Russia, because the country is the global leader in uranium fuel service, especially enrichment. Russia operates multiple enrichment plants, forming one of the world's largest separation work unit capacities, and its fuel cycle integration supports domestic reactors in the country, but also extensive export contracts worldwide. And that enrichment facility and capability is also inherently dual use, both civilian and military, and requires safeguards and international oversight. And therefore, geopolitics and sanctions are increasingly shaping access to the Russian fuel services. Below us, we see the Ural Electrochemical Combine in the city of Novouralsk, a closed Russian city. It is Russia's largest uranium enrichment facility. It is operated by Rosatom. It uses gas centrifuge facilities, and the whole town comprises multiple large-scale enrichment halls housing centrifuges at an industrial scale. And this complex supplies low-grade uranium for civilian nuclear fuel under international safeguards, reflecting a fuel cycle, not mining operations. Canada is a leading Western uranium producer anchored by ultra-high-grade deposits in the Saskatchewan Athabasca Basin. And Canadian uranium is prized for its grade, its reliability, and strong regulatory oversight. At the same time, the country has no uranium enrichment. All the conversion and enrichment occurs abroad. So production is export-oriented, supplying utilities across Europe, Asia, and North America. Some of the key project risks are timing, labor, and fuel cycle dependence outside the country. Below us, we see McArthur River in Saskatchewan. It's the world's largest high-grade uranium mine, jointly operated by Cameco and Orano, Canada. It is an entirely underground mine which uses freeze-wall technology to stabilize the water-saturated rock. So production was suspended in 2018 and resumed again in 2022 when the uranium market recovered. It has a capacity of about 6,900 tons of uranium per year. And from Canada, we travel to Australia, which holds the world's largest uranium reserves, although the country's annual production is relatively modest. Uranium is very tightly regulated as mining in the country. Australia exports uranium oxide only. There is no enrichment in the country. It exports for global nuclear power, not for nuclear armaments, especially in Asia and Europe. And the uranium contributes to Australia's role as the major energy exporter alongside its coal and LNG. And below us we see Olympic Dam in South Australia. Olympic Dam is the world's largest known single uranium deposit. It's a major copper resource. Mining is predominantly underground, about 350 meters below the surface, and not only produces copper but uranium, gold and silver, operated and owned by BHP. And uranium from Olympic Dam strengthens Australia's strategic energy exports despite the moderate export volumes. Our last tour and uranium visit is to Namibia, a major African uranium producer. Production is open pit, low grade, large scale, supplying the global nuclear fuel markets. It is entirely uranium oxide with conversion and enrichment done abroad. The sector is capital intensive, water intensive, operates in very arid, environmentally sensitive regions. And below us we see Husab in Erongo province. Husab is a giant open pit uranium mine near Swakopmund. It's owned by China General Nuclear Power Corporation via Swakop Uranium. Namibian state has a minority stake. You can see the uranium is granite hosted low-grade ore. Large truck and shovel fleets shovel across the mining pits, and there is some on-site leaching using acid that requires substantial both water and energy inputs. That uranium oxide is concentrated and then trucked to Walfish Bay, where it's exported mainly to Asia. So as we close on uranium, Mary, uranium presents 4 constraints and risks to the energy transition. The first one is in geopolitical concentration. Uranium mining, as we saw, and fuel services are concentrated in Kazakhstan and Russia, creating strategic supply risks. Fuel cycle bottlenecks, the conversion, enrichment and fuel fabrication can constrain reactor build-outs. Pricing and contracting cycles is such that underinvestment during low price periods easily trigger future supply tightness and volatility. And the last one is specific to uranium security and safeguards because of the transportation, enrichment, and waste management around uranium requires stringent oversight, raising cost and complexity. So, Mary, back to you for overall takeaways.
In concluding our tour, let's sum up on the landscape now and on the horizon along three main fronts: the diversification thrust and outcomes, dollars, prices, and supply availability, and the coverage and alternatives. Starting with the geopolitical focus and diversification, securing critical minerals is now a national security and energy independence issue, not just an economic one, with strategic diversification sought by the US, G7, and allies such as Canada, Australia, and Japan, who are starting to invest in non-Chinese sources, forming partnerships and building process capacity outside of China. On the dollars, prices, and supply availability front, an investment boom is brewing, with major mining companies starting to make haste to restructure and invest in frontier markets like the US and Argentina, and new processing tech, with policies further driving the markets such as US-China's export controls and arrangements and domestic initiatives, starting to shape investment and supply amid price volatility. On the coverage and alternatives front, relating to innovation in processing, focus is starting to shift to new sustainable processing methods beyond traditional smelting to break China's refining hold. And there is starting to be a broader mineral focus in terms of attention expanding beyond rare earths to other vulnerable minerals like antimony, tungsten, as well as the current extension we saw to cobalt and lithium. Specifically on recycling, there is a gap and a significant opportunity exists in recycling, as the current global recycling for rare earths is very low, around 1%, meaning much ends up in landfills. If we look to our horizon by 2035, we can expect progress in the diversification outcomes, but the refining choke point as lead times will keep the West partially dependent. On the dollars and prices, while policy supports investment, lead times and other constraints will continue to contribute to ongoing tightness and volatility in prices. China's midstream dominance is expected to endure even with diversification. China is still expected to control 70+% of rare earth refining and magnet materials by 2030, with only modest dilution by 2035, and concentration across other minerals also is expected to remain high. As such, supply gaps are expected to persist for key minerals. Under the EIA's 2025 outlook, lithium faces 40% primary supply deficit by 2030 and copper 30%, even if announced projects proceed, highlighting capital permitting, grade, and discovery constraints that we have identified in the materials. Mine development times are structurally long. Average lead times from discovery to production have stretched to 18 years, and many projects that would start in 2025 wouldn't materially de-risk supply into 2030s. So policy helps, but ongoing geopolitics is expected to bite in terms of licensing frictions and controls, and deals may ease certain constraints in the short term, but aren't expected to unlock full upstream, midstream independence. Finally, on the recycling front, we can expect a rise in that, but remaining a minority share. And maybe, ideally, we could get to end-of-life recycling at about 10% by 2030, but absent systematic collection and design changes, that's going to be tough. So the bottom line for 2030 is we can expect partial decoupling from China in mining and some processing, but not full independence. Tightness and volatility is expected to persist, with regional strategies from US, EU, Canada, Australia, Japan improving resilience, but still exposed at the refining choke point layers and constrained by long project cycles. Of course, all positions depend on the geopolitics of China and G7 countermoves, real progress on reversing constraints, and the pace of innovation. So thank you for your interest in the critical subject of critical minerals and rare earths. and I look forward to progress. So neither are critical or rare in availability to support electrification and our energy future. And as a final comment, as a Canadian, I have to reinforce I hope to see Canada make haste on its strategy to position itself as a player in this space, seizing its potential beyond uranium. Thank you again.